Hello, and welcome to another episode of Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. We've got book club this week. I am your host, Amanda, and my bookworm co-host is.
Hello, I'm Megan.
So today we will be continuing our discussion on Blake Boles' book. That's a little bit of a tongue twister there. Better Than College. So you can find the first episode of this whole book club series in the episode queue. Last week was the first week that we talked about it. So if you want to go catch up, you can find it there.
Yeah, so it's up there. Full disclosure, it's a long one. Okay. So Amanda and I each have respective roles for the podcast, and one of mine is editing. And, we've run over plenty of times, and I managed to get it down. Like I cut parts that I'm like, okay, in the scheme of things, I could take this out. I struggled to do it. So I worked on it for ages, and I just couldn't do an amazing job of cutting parts that really didn't sacrifice the content, right? So we will do our best today, but I'm sweating looking at our document of notes and being like, okay, here we go. So, but you know what? I feel like we had like a really meaty conversation last week. So, it is what it is. Break it in two parts. I don't know. We do our best. We try.
That's it. We try, and there's nothing that says you have to listen to it all the way through if you just don't have time, right? It'll save your spot. Come back to it later. Yeah. No worries. All right. So how does the whole virtual book club thing work? You do not have to actually read the book if you don't want to. We do not judge. We do not expect it. You can tune in. You can listen to our back and forth and whatever we have to say. Same difference. Listen, read and listen. It doesn't matter. If you do want to read the book, you can find a link in the podcast description below in our show notes or whatever. P.S. We do get a little bit of 10, 15 cents from Amazon if you use our link. It doesn't cost you anything more, but it does help support the podcast. So we definitely thank you whenever you use any of our affiliate links. They're not all affiliate links, but most of the books are. And last, but maybe most importantly, if you have any interest in joining us for a book club, and we didn't just pull this out because we're like, hey, we think people really want to hang out with us. We actually got feedback that people wanted to do this. So if you want to join us for a book club, come on and talk through the book with us. Send us a DM with a little intro video. We also have an option where you can kind of do it through our website, but you can find us on any of our social media pages and just, send us a little message with a video. Tell us what you're thinking, why you think it would be fun. We'll give it a look and reach out with books we've got coming up. We have our next several books are already lined up. So yeah, we would love to welcome you when we kind of come back and dive back in January.
2025. Yeah, it'll be awesome.
2025. Can you believe it?
I know, right?
I can't.
So before we start on this week's reading, a quick follow-up from last week. So last week we were talking about cost of living stats that were in the book. And Amanda, who in all fairness lives in San Diego, was like, these numbers are complete bullshit, right? Not that she was calling bullshit on Blake, but just like, what fantasy land does this come from? And the book is a little bit older and all that stuff too, right? So right before we recorded last week, I had emailed Blake and was like, can we get some 2024 variation of these statistics? And I was thinking the stats in the book were his particular stats, his living numbers, right? So he did reply with some clarification. So he said the numbers in the book, and this is a quote here, were genuinely based on the early 20-somethings that he knew in Nashville, living in not so fancy shared housing in rougher parts of town, sharing, cooking most meals, cycling a lot, and taking advantage of bus passes. So he said even at the time of publication, which is 10 plus years ago, 12 years ago, maybe, people were like, these numbers are ridiculous, right? And he's like, I swear to you, I got them from people who were actually living those numbers and were just living that life of frugality. So they weren't his numbers, which was my interpretation. So then I said, well, like, what about your current living expenses? And basically he was like, I don't live like an early 20-something anymore, right? I'm a little bit older, a little bit more established. So he's like, I still live very frugally, but it's not going to be an apples to apples comparison to what was in the book because I don't live that life anymore, right? I don't think he's couch surfing necessarily and, doing some of the things that are mentioned in the book anymore. But it was nice to have clarification on that. The funny thing was he also said, he goes, send me the link when the episode's out. And I was thinking, oh goodness, right? Because Amanda called bullshit a couple of times last week.
I really apologize for my co-host, but we do believe in open dialogue.
No, I genuinely said that.
Like we really lean into this, like we're two very different people and yet we still love and respect each other.
I totally said that. I said, so my co-host is an aggressive academic homeschooler. And I said, she had a lot of thoughts. I think I put it in like asterisks with like things and all that. And I go, but that's the foundation of our podcast, right? Is that we approach things from a wildly different perspective and, all that. But our kids are doing awesome. And, we respect what the other one is doing. And he was all for it. He was like, I'm all for it. He goes, now I'm curious to see what a lot of thoughts means. So I'm like, okay. So,
well, fuck me.
Exactly.
Hi, Blake.
So, but agreed that like the discourse of two very different perspectives coming together is a really healthy discourse. So he's all in for it. So don't stress.
Right. Like this is an excellent example. Like we're just post-election week and there's a lot of crap out there where people don't agree and they can't disagree in anything close to a polite, civil manner. And I'm so sick of the people who are like, it's my way or you don't know how to be nice. I saw a thing on social media that said like the Make America Kind Again. Have you seen this image where it's like a red and a blue person hugging and they're in the shape of the United States? And someone was like, that anyone who was posting this voted for Trump exactly. And they just want you to shut up and be nice. Yeah. And I'm like, right? Like that's such bullshit. Like you can have really deep, intelligent, thoughtful conversations where you disagree and you don't need to just shut people down or get like insanely rude, right? Like, I mean, again, shut people down who aren't respecting rights, like basic fundamental human rights, like moral issues and whatever. But that's not what this is, right? This is a different, like how do you different ways of living your life and going about it. It's different. It's okay.
We could do it. The section that we're discussing today is called What to Do Instead of College. And it's just kind of like one big meaty section that's broken down into some subsections. And so this section starts off with 5 stories of young adults, teens who opted not to go to college and what their journey looked like instead and how they found their pathway sans college. So yeah, I kind of made some notes on individual journeys that were there and some of the things that I pulled out, specific sections, but you've kind of got like an overall overview. How was that for yes, educated. Yes. Right. Okay.
Well, you go ahead and go give yours, okay. and then I'll give my poo-poo. I feel kind of bad. I was like, man, I just feel so negative, like writing up my thoughts.
Oh, I put my notes in after you today, and there's one bullet point that I'm like super excited to get to. Like it's gonna make my whole day. So it's good. All right. So the first example was this young woman who was kind of traveling and volunteering on farms and doing all kinds of stuff. Discovers at one point while farm working that she has a deep connection to midwifery, which I get like a Duggar vibe anytime I hear midwifery because that's like all the girls were allowed to do. But I'm sure this is a very different scenario, but it's just always the thing that pops into my head. And then she ended up joining a volunteer trip to Senegal where she had the opportunity to deliver dozens of babies, etc. And then goes on to start her own midwifery business she gets certifications and goes to conferences and, she doesn't just like, Google it and then start delivering babies. But there's that. So there was that one. Then the next note that I had was there's a person in here named Wheezy, and I didn't take as much out of Wheezy's story except towards the end where it said that Wheezy was considering transferring to a low residency program that better matched her new lifestyle. And I remember I was reading it thinking like low residency program, what the heck is that? But then there's a footnote and it references Prescott College in Arizona. And I have been told about Prescott College before that some sort of learner-led program. When I try to find it online, I don't get it too far. Like, to be fair, I haven't deep into it. There are some specific unschooling colleges. The name is going to escape me because it's like 1 a.m. for me where we're recording. There's one in Massachusetts and I forget the name of it. But anyway, it's been around since like the 70s. It's an amazing unschooling college. There was Quest in Canada that unfortunately closed, but this Prescott program is supposedly embedded into like a more traditional structure as well. Like it kind of is an option at a more traditional university. And it's always been kind of something on my list to dig into. So if you know about the Prescott College program, I'm all ears. Send a message. I would love to hear more about it. So that was a note that I made because one of our 5 examples, or one of our 5 case studies was considering that program. Then we had another individual who started a building company, building greenhouses. And there was a quote in that section that said, living debt-free, engaged with his goals, and surrounded by a community who shared his values, Sean deeply appreciated his decision to skip college. And really, I think like last week, we kind of talked again about like how realistic is it, right? To skip college and kind of take that gamble in a society where most companies are very hell-bent on college. And Amanda shared some statistics last week, et cetera, and things like that that kind of leaned into that. But I thought, really, this is a lifestyle choice, right? It's like, yeah, I'm not going to make IBM money. I'm not going to make Facebook money. I'm not going to make, whatever. But if I'm living debt-free, engaged with my goals, and surrounded with a community who shares my values, that to me is worth more than the things that I've potentially given up based upon this choice that I've made. So I liked that out there. I put that there. This is all from that case study of 5 individuals. I'm just kind of going through all my notes. The next one is on page 50. It's a story about this homeschooler/unschooler named Brenna. And again, I put a little bit of notes here about Brenna, but one of them was that she was in a program called Odyssey of the Mind. Are you familiar with Odyssey of the Mind, Amanda? Is that a thing there?
No, I'm not very familiar.
Okay, so Odyssey of the Mind, in theory, is this really cool program where you join this troupe and you work on, it's a national competition, right? And you join a group and you're on this team and there's a challenge that needs to be solved for that year. And so the kind of headquarters of Odyssey of the Mind comes out with these challenges. They're different for different age brackets and there's rules and you can come up with a project or a skit or something like that. And it's really about creative work and collaboration and teamwork and all sorts of stuff. And there's an adult who coaches your Odyssey team who is there for kind of like minor steering. But for the most part, it's student-led and it's student-driven. You'll be shocked to know that my kids have done Odyssey of the Mind. For us, I will say, the team that you choose will make or break your experience. It was when we were living in North Carolina, and it was really an interesting group, right? That was there. And the mom, who was kind of our Odyssey captain, who I'm sure will never listen to our podcast a day in her life, was quite frankly Regina fucking George. Like she was just, it was not a positive experience. But at the end, you go to this big competition, and I got to see what it looked like on of other people and some of the teams. Oh my gosh, what they put together. And then it goes on. There's like states and nationals and all kinds of stuff, and there's scholarships at play. It's really cool. So if it sounds, I'm not doing it justice by explaining it because my experience wasn't the rich experience it was meant to because of Regina George. So we were just like counting the days till it was over. But it's something to look into. It's pretty cool. So anyway, Odyssey of the Mind is all part of Regina. Poor girl. Odyssey of the Mind is all part of Brenna, one of the sample people in our book. Her experience, she's in college. She's not feeling fulfilled in college. She feels this deep connection to ceramic art. She can't quite make it happen. She keeps going back to college, keeps trying college. It's not working. Finally leaves, goes into a depressive period, trying to kind of like regroup and figure out what's happening, and finally becomes a ceramicist. I thought it was interesting because on page 51, where it talked about her unfilled desire to create art, it reminded me a little bit of our last book, which was The Danish Way of Raising Teens. Like, it made me think, like, how would this be handled in Denmark, right? Like, and if their goal is fulfillment and happiness and, in-depth purpose and all that kind of stuff, I was thinking, like, would Brenna have ever ended up at college? Would she be a ceramicist? Like, what happens in that scenario in Denmark? Like, we read the whole book. Do you have any, what do you think? I'm just emphasizing, I have no answers.
Yeah, I don't know. But I feel like it's an entirely different thing altogether in Europe because of the difference in like what we call high school and how it like splits off and differentiates into different things. So
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you can't really do like an apples to apples comparison, because at 16 she would have been in a totally different college track that was leading her into arts. So maybe art school there or creating is different.
That's
because
true.
it's not so general ed even at 18, 19. But I don't know for sure. I didn't fully go through that system, right? I did like a fellowship kind of study abroad thing in the UK in university, but I personally have no experience other than friends who I lived with at that time who had gone through that system. So I don't know.
It's a good point. Yeah. I hadn't looked at it that way, but it's so true, right? Because I was kind of reading it and thinking like, okay, we just read our last book was all about focusing on like teens and happiness and like ultimate purpose in life and all kinds of stuff, you know? And I was thinking like, there's a difference, right? We talked about the Danish welfare state in the last book, right? So here it's kind of like you want to be a ceramicist and that's all lovely, but that's going to have to be a free time activity because there's no way to survive in the US as a ceramicist. Like, lovely goal, but no, like, how do you plan to have health insurance, right? You know, how do you plan to ever be able to afford a house? How do you, you know, all of these things.
How are you going to pay rent? You don't even need to afford a house. How are you going to pay rent?
Exactly.
On a shared bedroom? Making $100 pots. Like,
I know in the book when it was like she had gotten up to $100 item, and I was like, oh, Amanda's gonna have a field day with that. So like, oh, you know, another few thousand pots and you'll be good to go. So it's funny because we've been playing a game. So I've been in Europe now for about 2 weeks, and my husband is in the Caribbean, which is his home country, and he's working there, and my parents are still in the States getting ready for their next chapter as well. The kids and I left ahead of time and went to Europe, and we've been playing what I've been calling Polish prices right in the family group text. For like every time I go to the supermarket, I take a picture of something and I'm like, guess how much it cost, right? You know, because the cost in the US has just become so astronomical, you know. And it's like, then I'll use like really wacky things for size reference, and I'll be like, you know, so and so for size reference or such and such for size reference. And it's just bananas. And so I think like maybe part of the challenge with some of the thoughts in this book surround with how unrealistic it is to not be part of the system in the US, because we don't have a government system that's going to provide in most ways, right? And so the system is your company, right? Or the system is all of that. And so that kind of struck me when I was reading that one section. So I had that note there, and I think that was the end of my notes for the five people situation. But I mean, the basic concept is right that they all find their path in some way, shape, or form, and it's not going on to say they've all become multimillionaires, but they're all happy, they're all fulfilled, they're all self-sufficient. Okay, so those were my notes.
Yeah, and so I read all the same stories, and then I went back on the first page, and I'm just like, I was just like, what insane, what immense amounts of privilege like are highlighted in these stories, right? And that's we've talked before, right? If you follow along and you know anything about us, you know I live in Southern California, and that influences a lot. But what you might also not be fully aware of, and I have talked about it a little bit more here lately, but I grew up in a very rural area in the Midwest, right? I grew up in rural Iowa, and in a very like working class family, and so that also influences a lot of where I've come from, right? Like my parents worked very hard to give me the opportunities that I had, and I have changed my situation in life quite a lot because of that. And so when I see these things, right, I'm just like, I don't know. I really struggle with this. Like these kids, they're taking unpaid internships, and they're traveling the US and the world on mommy and daddy's frequent flyer miles.
That one did stand out to me.
They're just like generally doing like really unrealistic things for a lot of people. And it really reminded me of, so when I was in high school, like junior year, I was offered a summer internship for women in STEM, and it was at one of the state universities there in Iowa. It's very prestigious. It was a very big deal. And I was like kind of recruited into it or for it because in any event, I didn't get to go, right? It came with a stipend, as these things often do, but it was not a very large stipend. And my family lived several hours away from the university. So there's no way the stipend was going to cover the cost of me living in the small city where the university was and all of these kinds of things. And, they were just like, no, like you cannot afford to do that. Like you have to get a summer job that pays well, and you have to work like full time this summer because you need that money to pay for your extracurricular sports fees and your club fees. And you need to start saving up for after high school because you're going to have to move out of the house and take care of yourself. And like you need extra money for the school year to pay your car payment and pay your gas and all of those kinds of things for when the school year like gets busy and you can't pick up as many hours as you need to cover those monthly things that you have monthly expenses you have to pay for. And it's not just like because I want to go out with my friends, right? Like, no, I have to make a car payment and I have to pay for my own gas and I have, these things. And there's just like, these are the realities for a lot of people. And now in the position that I'm in and the exposure that I've had and the world that I now navigate, of course, I understand the advantage of an unpaid or poorly paid internship, right? Like I know that the kids who have the privilege of being able to attend those things and participate in those things have a huge leg up in the
100%.
world. But I also know that the cost of that is far greater than most people realize and makes it really unrealistic for the less advantaged people. And for me, I'm struggling with a lot of this book because I feel like it's just not realistic for the way that I grew up and most of the people that I know.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. Yeah. I mean, unpaid internships are definitely part of the problem, right? Part of the systemic problem that exists, especially in the United States. So I can completely see that. Okay. The note that I was really excited about is the next one. So
this came up in some other book, right? I don't remember what book, but we've talked about this before.
I didn't feel like we had
this idea. I'm sure it came up for something else, but the quote is on page 54 and it says, "Do what you love and the money will follow." It's embedded in a much larger quote. But for me, I pulled that out and it's just that thing. I've said it before. I'll say it again. Like, I do not like this way of thinking. It does not work for me. For me personally, the minute you tell me I have to earn a living from something and it's no longer like a hobby that brings me joy, but I have to actually make enough money to live off of it, like I'm not having fun anymore. Like it's not a hobby anymore. Now I have to do it. And that's I don't operate that way. My brain does not work that way. So,
I mean, there's definitely those two schools of thought out there that are very, very different. And that's probably it, right? It's brain wiring, right? Because there's the people who are like, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life, which is one of those cheesy sayings that floats around, right? But then there's other people who are like, you do not have to monetize your hobbies, right? You can keep your hobbies pure for the sake of enjoyment and for the sake of loving them. So it's two very different camps when it comes to that kind of stuff. So you had put your notes in the document first, and like you will likely not be terribly surprised to know that I had a profound and life-altering encounter about 6 to 7 years ago. And the core principle of it was do what you love and the money will follow. And it has literally shaped decisions that we have made in the years since. So, okay, small story. My husband is not from the US, and for whatever reason, when you're not from someplace and you see stuff like online or in the news or in books or magazines, movies, whatever, you start to like idolize certain things from other places, even though you don't really have like full reference of them. Okay. For whatever reason, my husband thought that Gatlinburg, Tennessee was the cat's pajamas, right? Like this was going to be the be all and end all of life was Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Okay. For years, he would be like, you know what we should do for the holidays? We should get a cabin in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I'm like, why the fuck are we going to Gatlinburg, Tennessee? So when we were living in North Carolina, now it's relatively close by. There's no way I'm getting out of going to Gatlinburg, Tennessee. So we make a reservation. I run the dates by him, whatever we were going to go for my daughter's birthday, which is in April. So I make the reservation. My mom was going to come. It was like the whole thing, right? Like the week before, he ends up having to go out of the country for work. And so we end up in Gatlinburg, Tennessee without him. He doesn't even come. And I'm like, I am literally here because this is your American dream. Like, I'd never been before. There's like Main Street. Have you been before, Amanda?
No.
Okay. So,
No.
okay. There's like a Main Street area that's like really touristy and pretty cheesy and like all that stuff. But there's a national park there, right? Which I know national parks aren't like super your jam, but Great Smoky Mountain is there, which is pretty awesome. Okay. But there's this thing that's kind of like off the beaten path from the touristy area called the Artist Circle. And it's just these amazing craftsmen who have spaces, have shops on these loops. We met this guy, Sparky, who was a glass blower. Oh my gosh. We went back multiple days. Like, he was just so incredible. And the kids were like transfixed by the whole experience. So anyway, one day we're there and we had seen this shop as we drove into town that was right at the edge of the Artist Circle. It was close to the main road, and they had all these carved bears outside. And I thought, oh, I want to go back and figure out what those bears are all about. So we go back, and they weren't open, but we had pulled into the parking lot, and the bears were all outside, like not like locked up or anything. Like, they're just out there. So we're just looking at the bears, and this guy gets out of the car, and long story short, we find out like it's his shop, and they're closed that day, but he was waiting on a lumber delivery, somebody who like brings him big whole logs and whatever. And so whatever, he goes, come tomorrow, I'll be working. So we spent like the entire day there. So this guy was homeschooled and is this incredible artist who carves with a chainsaw. Ironically, his mom was the chainsaw carving champion of the United States or something, which I didn't even know was a thing. And then he's in business with his sister, and his sister does like fine detail work and then paints the bears, right? But oh my gosh, the kids just like were sucked in, and they asked a million questions, and he spent so much time with them, and it was just incredible. And that was his thing, was do what you love and the money will follow, right? So maybe like a year or two later, my own daughter, who's now 15, is an artist. We were there for her birthday. She had been doing these Acton's children's business fairs, and she was getting a little bit frustrated that she would have to spend a lot of time preparing items that she thought she would sell well at the business fair. And then a lot of times at the business fair, somebody would see something and say, oh, I love this, but I wish it was red. And so she would take a custom order. And so then after the fair, she still had work to do for the fair that was already done. And she was, for the age she was, I mean, she started at 8, she was making ridiculous money, right? But she was like, I never get to create the way I want to create, right? She was like our ceramicist friend. She was like, I never get to do the thing that I actually want to explore and grow as an artist and do all this kind of stuff. So around the age of like 11, 12, that frustration was like really kind of peaking. And I said to her, you don't need an income, girlfriend. Like, you're 11, you're 12. Like, we got you. Like, you're not paying rent. You don't have a phone bill. She didn't even have a phone, I said, you remember what Jake said when we went? That was his name, Jake. Amazing woodcarver. If you're ever in Gatlinburg, go see Jake. Okay. So I said, do what you love. And I said, that's what we are doing. And do you know, girlfriend changed everything, right? Switched it up where she only creates what she wants when she wants. There are some times where she has like magazine articles due, but she's proposing the project. So it's still what she wants to create, right? She just has deadlines for stuff like that because she writes for a whole bunch of magazines and stuff now. But when I tell you that she went from having like this little following online and doing these little local fairs and whatever, do what you love and the money will follow. She shifted her mindset. She started doing what she wanted. She still had a way to make some money baked into the whole, here's what I'm going to do. Blew up online, started getting magazine deals, started getting approached by, this, that, the other thing, like sponsorships, all this kind of stuff. It freaking worked. Like, and it wasn't, now granted, the stakes were super low, right? She was 11, she was 12, she's almost 16 now, like, and, all this stuff, but it freaking worked, right? And it was just unbelievable to see how once she started living her purpose, everything opened. It was like one of those gift boxes that just keeps opening and opening with like origami stairs coming out of it, It was amazing. So I'm a huge do what you love and the money will follow person. I mean, Amanda, we love the podcast and we've made like $8. So like, you really, it's hypocritical of you to say that it doesn't work.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? Like if I was doing this because, and in large part, I do actually really love helping people, right? Like giving advice, sharing my 2 cents, trying to help people like come up with new ideas or new ways to think about things. Like I'm all about the idea that like there are a million paths and I can only walk so many of them. So tell me about yours. Like help me see the journey you're on. Help me see where you're going, because I can't possibly walk all of them and I want to know about all of them, right? So I do really love that. But if I was doing this, expecting that it was going to pay even for the microphone that I use, like 5 months in, I would be so depressed because it's not even paid a down payment on the microphone that I bought to use for the podcast. That's not counting the camera that I bought for it, or the light that I bought for it, or the new computer that I need to buy for it, right? Like, so yeah.
I know. So it's interesting. I mean, we just did that whole episode on like goals and law of attraction and stuff like that, but it freaking worked. Like, but again, I feel like you can throw yourself more fully into the law of attraction when you don't have a mortgage, right?
And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, true too. Right? Like I'll talk about it in one of my next comments, a couple comments down. So yeah, you had a comment, you were gonna.
Oh, so, yeah. So in the book, so one of the next things is just this ZTC strategy, which is zero tuition college, which we talked about last week, ZTC. And so it's just a blueprint, right? First is self-knowledge, which we talked about last week. Second was giving yourself assignments of, reading books, starting businesses, practicing, etc. So there's structure within the no college plan. It's not just like, the wing it and see how it comes out sort of thing, unless it's the do what you love and the money will follow plan. I don't know. They contradict one another a little. The next is create and share value, volunteer, get hired, sell your work, organize groups, plan events, etc. Fourth was find support. And that's a recurring theme in the unschooling world in general, right? Is mentorship, right? Asking for support, asking for guidance, asking for opportunities. And 99% of the time they pan out. So at least in our experience. And then the last was market yourself, building an online portfolio, etc. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of those as we go through. But those were kind of the steps that kick off this next section.
Well, yeah, and the whole kind of rest of this chapter is kind of deep diving into each of those steps. I just liked on page 57, he's talking about the build self-knowledge. And like Megan said, we talked about it a lot more last week, I think. But he does break it down. And he says, part of building self-knowledge includes exposing yourself to new people, places, and ideas. And spending time in solitary, unguided contemplation. And I liked that specific chapter and the way he broke it down. I do think that is an important part. I definitely agree with that, right? This idea of building self-knowledge, you have to really open yourself up and expose yourself to new things. And you have to also be willing to quietly process them and think about them and figure out what they mean to you, and if you're integrating them or if you're just adding to your knowledge, or like I definitely agree with that. This is where we come back to that thing of like, I think for the vast majority of people, the easiest way to guarantee that is college. So yeah, fundamental difference there. But
and here I was thinking, I'll note the timestamp and send it to Blake in my next email. But no, okay, we're back to that. Okay. So on 57, he starts 3 questions about self-knowledge, which I love.
I thought were bullshit.
So one was, if you were going to die 1 year from today, what would you do differently? If you had 3 years to create something that would change your world, how would you begin? And the next one is, if you were forbidden from accumulating vast material wealth, how would you live differently? And I thought those were awesome. Now, he does break those questions down even more. And so there is a thing here in the section about if you were forbidden from accumulating vast material wealth. Right below that section, there's a thing that says, ask yourself, how far-fetched are these scenarios? Why shouldn't I begin acting upon my answers? it says it's possible that you will discover tomorrow that you have cancer and have a year left to live. You could die in a car accident, etc. I will say, like Amanda talked about, growing up in the Midwest and the experience that she had. And we talked about this last week, like everyone comes to something with their personal experience and it's going to shape how they view stuff, right? So I will say, and I don't know if I've ever mentioned it on the podcast. I certainly don't think I've gone into any depth, right? But about 10 years ago, my husband was diagnosed with cancer. And in the beginning, it was one of these things where it was like, oh, we think we caught it early. He's young and healthy. It'll be fine. And thankfully, he is fine today. But we didn't fucking catch it early. And none of what happened for the next minimum 2 years was fine. It was one of those things where, like, when I look back at it now, I'm like, I'm not even sure how we survived that. It was such a hellacious situation and involved so many getting hit by a bus only to barely stand back up again and get hit by another bus that was bigger than the last one type of situation. And the mountains of debt and the mountains of paperwork, even with amazing insurance, the mountains of debt that we had and all of that. And it just, I don't think there's any way you come out of that ever the same, right? Like it just, and it has been definitely one of my things of like, we're doing it. We're hitting our bucket list. We're, doing the thing. We'll save money and be responsible human beings balanced with you only live once, right? And so we do quite a bit of that as well, because on numerous occasions, I mean, there was literally a time when he went into the hospital for an ingrown hair and was in the ICU for 8 days because he was so sick and he had like 2 white blood cells left, for crying out loud, practically, that an ingrown hair was almost enough to kill him. It was that bad. So it's like, there's no way of coming back from that and not thinking like it says in the book, like if you only had 1 year left to live, what would you do? Because we were very close to that scenario. And so I'm like, yeah, I like it. I'm all down for it. So, but again, it's that life perspective, right?
I think it does. You can't help but have it influence your life. And then, like, even with these questions, right? For me, my biggest hang up was the middle question. Like, if you had 3 years to create something that would change your world, how would you begin? Like, I'm good. Thanks. I don't need to build anything to change my world. Like, this is the world I live in, and I'm every day working towards making it the world that I want to live in, but I'm not trying to worry about like change my world in 3 years. Like, back off, leave me alone. I'm good.
I got enough on my plate.
Yeah, like I'm gonna just keep plugging along in the direction that I want to go in general, but like don't put 3 years on me. That's your timeline, not mine. And then, like, if you're forbidden from accumulating vast material wealth, like, and then he goes on to say that that's basically like, yeah, you can still save, to make sure you have like 6 months of spending and an apartment to rent and things like that. But like, I would guess that the vast majority of Americans are not anywhere close to that. Yeah. And even in our family, like, we have more than that because we have retirement savings, like, and so our retirement savings definitely is more than 6 months worth of living expenses. But we don't have vast material wealth, and our bank owns our condo because we have a mortgage, right? And so, yeah, that's not the same as renting, but at the same time, you couldn't possibly rent where we live for the price of our mortgage, right? Our mortgage is significantly cheaper than the cost of renting these days. And so I'm like, like, even with as well off as we are comparatively, we're still probably in that category, like, without a significant amount of material wealth. And so, yeah, I was just like, I feel like what that looks like is just not quite maybe the point that he was trying to drive home, especially in this day and age.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That makes sense. Then we both skipped quite a few pages before having our next note. On 69, there's a section here. It starts really at the bottom of page 68 about create a small enterprise and goes into 69. And for me, one of my big challenges in the United States when it comes to entrepreneurship is that our country, at least in my perspective, is built around corporations, right? It's not built for you to branch out on your own and be successful. Health insurance is always top of mind for me because, you know, my husband thankfully isn't getting like consistent testing now as far as like PET scans and stuff like that, but did for 5 years after even he was in remission, right? And then after 5 years, then it was cancer free and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But like, we will never go without health insurance. Like, it's just not an option. I know there are some people who can put their head on a pillow at night and sleep that way, and that's awesome. Like, it's just, but we can't. Like, there's no way that I could ever feel comfortable doing that after what we've been through. And so it's like, as an entrepreneur, to get affordable health insurance, it's decent health insurance that doesn't have an astronomical deductible, right? It doesn't exist. So I just feel like I am all for entrepreneurship. It's been a huge part of our homeschooling journey. At some point, we'll do an episode on it. We'll talk about it. But I don't feel like the US is structured to support and uplift entrepreneurs, which sucks.
Yeah. I guess though I would be curious if there are other places that are better and what that looks like, you know, like, because I'm just thinking about like our time of living in Europe and that thing of like, well, yes, you do have much more of like that social welfare network system, right? The safety net there, and it gives that. But in general, Europe is in many ways even more like kind of traditional and set in its ways, and like you should follow this prescribed thing. And so like, yeah, maybe you do have a small business, you have a small restaurant or something like that, but it's because your family had a small restaurant. It's the family restaurant, and you're gonna, you know, like not so much that you're completely branching out on your own or like coming up with a completely new business and like a super entrepreneurial mentality or spirit. So I wonder, but yeah, that's a whole other conversation for another podcast.
In another country, hit us up in the comments and tell us how it works other places, you know, because it's a curious point.
Yeah, what you think, how you think it comes down. Yeah. But yeah, I also agree with you, right? I mean, it's that we can come up with a million examples. I had cancer. Thankfully for me, they caught it early, but I have a kind of cancer that you don't ever get to say you're in remission because it doesn't come back for 15 to 20 years. And so, you know, like I'm not in a position to be able to be like, oh, well, I don't need health insurance because it shouldn't come back for another 7 years. You know, like actually, I think I'm going to stick with that. And I'm going to be real worried about pre-existing condition clauses because that's never going to leave my medical chart, you know, like, and that's a fear that will just, you know, like we'll always have to be there. And, you know, these are the kinds of things that you have to be aware of. And unfortunately, in the US, it's still really important to have a job or to be married to someone who has a corporate job, right? Yeah. My next note, well, actually, I just want to quickly back up a little. So if you are on the fence about buying this book because you're like, oh, I think I get it. There's a section, we skipped over it, but he's talking about how to give yourself assignments and what that might look like for specific things. And he covers traveling the world, finding a vocation, becoming a public intellectual, teaching a course, creating a small enterprise, exploring the world of ideas. And it's like, it's really broken down. I didn't get a lot from it because it doesn't resonate with me. Like for the most part, these things, I was like, I wouldn't want to do those things. Like when I travel the world, I don't want to do those things. When I explore ideas, I don't want to put this kind of structure in and around it. So I didn't make very many notes. But if it's something that you're like, I like this idea and, you know, like, what does that look like? He does give some very specific ideas and suggestions, and it might be worth picking it up or at the very least checking it out from the library, right? So then, yeah, my next comment was on page 73. And the section is called Create and Share Value. And for me, I just like this whole section felt like the time that I lived in San Francisco from 2010 to 2011, right? The Great Recession had hit Silicon Valley, something fierce. It was that thing where everyone was working on these side projects. Everyone had their main job that brought their money in, and then everyone had like another side project, sometimes two, sometimes three, where they're like developing a software program or an app, or they're trying to build some small company that someone's going to buy. And it just seemed like no one ever slowed down and like took time for fun, took time for friendships or relationships. I mean, it was just the hustle, right? It was all about the hustle. And even back when I didn't make enough money to really survive well, I didn't want to participate in that level of hustle, right? That did not bring me joy. That like I I may not be able to Marie Kondo my clothing, but like that did not bring me joy. It's not my jam. And I like a lot of what I read in this section of the book, I felt like there's just so much hustle, constant hustle necessary. And yeah, it's like I said, it's not my jam.
I didn't pick up on that, but now that I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see that. The other note that I made is we talked about in those 5 steps a little while ago about creating an online portfolio for yourself and such like that. And, it's a blog and a photo journal and a YouTube channel and a short video and a website and all this kind of stuff. And I just kind of put down I'd love to hear a 2024 variation on that or a take on that, because I feel like in a way, blogging and social media obviously is bigger than it was in 2012, but the opportunity for exposure, I feel like, is bigger now because there's so many people on there. But I also feel like it's harder to break through because it's so oversaturated, right? I mean, even when we started our podcast, we took a bunch of classes and stuff on like how to podcast, and the stats on how many podcasts never make it off the ground because the barrier to entry is so low. I mean, you literally you need your microphone and a spare bathroom in Amanda's case, and you go out there and podcast, and so it's the same thing. Like anybody can do a website, anybody can do, and so you really have to do something so unique. And so because for every Elise Myers or whoever, there's how many people who are just hello. For every one of those, there's freaking us, who are like we're just like. I'm like, oh my gosh, somebody liked our video on TikTok, and I'm like, eventually it'll break, but it hasn't, I mean, like somehow people are finding our podcast and like that's been awesome, but we cannot get visibility on social media no matter what we do. And so I feel like it's like in a way it's good and it's bad. Like there's more social media, but then it's also harder to get recognized.
Yeah, for sure. And what that looks like, right? Like there are a lot of podcasts that don't do anything on social media. Like some of my favorite ones have almost crickets on their social media pages because that just doesn't translate, right? Like your social media engagement doesn't actually really boost your podcast listens, and like they're just different markets. And so yeah, it is an interesting question of like what that looks like these days, and like blogging, what does that really get you, and is a social media presence, does that actually feed into blogging, or does it help, or how all these things. I think because there's so much, there's probably more division, and it's probably even more siloed now than it used to be. Yeah, that is an interesting thing to think about. All right, so before we get into the second half of this chapter, we just want to take a quick minute to say hey. Not only hey, but if you're listening when this first comes out, or even if you're listening later for context, right? We've just had the 2024 presidential elections here in the United States. We're a progressive, secular podcast. Obviously, we focus on homeschooling, but we also talk about life and parenting and all kinds of things. So it's a really hard time. It's not an easy time to be secular or progressive or open-minded in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, a woman, part of the LGBTQIA plus community. I mean, like we could just go on and on, right? The list could go on and on of the groups and minorities that it's hard being right now. But we are building a community. That's one of the big things that we want to do, that we are doing. And one of those ways, right? We have the Patreon. We've talked about the Patreon quite a bit, but we also have this community on Facebook. And we try to we're very active in it. Megan and I are both very active in it, and we really keep tabs on things. We really vet the posts that go in there. We keep an eye on the comments and things like that. No one's being a jerk in there. We're not having it. You come and be nice. You come and be supportive. And if you can't be both of those things, then we don't want you there. And unapologetically so. Like, we are building an awesome, supportive community for secular progressive folks, and we would love for you to join us. It's pretty easy to find. It's literally called Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. I know. Who would have thought?
Nothing if not
so
consistent.
Yes, there you go. So you can just search it and then filter for groups, right? We do have on Facebook, we have both our like public forward facing page, just general page, and then we have the community, the group. And there are a couple questions you have to answer. Sometimes it takes a little while for the answers to come through to us, so if you don't get approved immediately, don't worry. Sometimes it takes us a little longer to make sure we have all the information, because like I said, we really are vetting it and making sure that we keep it a safe, supportive place for everyone. But we would love for you to come join us. Come join the conversation.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. All right. And so with that, the first talking point of the second part of this chapter is 78. And the section is literally called Find Support. This is not new, right? We talk about this in all kinds of different ways, the importance of finding support and that kind of thing. And I think we can all agree that finding support is important. For me, what I pulled out is on the next page, 79. Under that, it says finding peer community. And it talks about this idea of like, you might like to move to a college campus area and just live there and hang out and participate in all of the things that are college life without actually enrolling, and like talk to the professors and go to classes, but don't actually take them, and just go and learn from that way. And then, which I'm like, I have mixed feelings on that. But then he goes on to suggest that you should get a group of friends together to start your own student house. He talks about you're going to be the one to do it, and you're going to make this part of your tuition-free college experience by creating an assignment for yourself, and you're going to organize the rent, and you're going to organize a chore chart, and all of these things that you're going to do for a bunch of other young adults. And I was like, this just sounds like my freaking nightmare. Like, trying to track down a bunch of other 18 and 19-year-olds and hold them accountable for all of this crap. Like, I know, for no money, like, just because I want the experience and to pretend like I went to college when I didn't actually go to college. Like, no.
No, thank
No.
you. So the interesting thing when I read that was, I was thinking, okay, you're going to be college adjacent without being in college, right? But I don't know if it's different in college, because people are older and things change as you age, right? Like, I mean, we've talked about it before. Like, I'm an only child. My husband is one of 5 siblings, and sibling dynamic is kind of an odd thing for me because I just never experienced it. But like, when I know, like when we first got together, his youngest brother was like 5, right? We weren't hanging out with his 5-year-old brother a whole lot, right? But now we'll like double date with him and his girlfriend of like 10 years, right? Or things like that. Like, the dynamic shifts as people get older and people get closer in different ways and things like that. So maybe that parallels a little bit and it's different. But I know for us, like, being college adjacent in this town would not necessarily, I feel like, form connections, because you're living 2 vastly different experiences, right? And so for us, like, being pretty out there unschoolers, in homeschooling groups, we stick out like sore thumbs, right? And it was interesting because I was talking to Mary, not last night, but the night before, who's a member of our community. She submitted our student spotlight this week, also an unschooling family, said the same thing. Like, we do not jive with the homeschool community here, because we're just living such vastly different experiences that sometimes it's really hard to find common ground in conversations. Not like you can't get along, but you're having these really superficial, chit chat conversations, because you're not making deep connections with people who are just living such a different experience than you. And so I wasn't necessarily sure that living on campus, what's that movie, Old School, with Will Ferrell, right? Like, you know, like, like just being on campus is not necessarily going to help you relate to the college, but maybe at that age it's different. Maybe it's easier to find common ground. And I don't know, because I haven't done it, but I know for us as teens in the homeschool community, hanging out with very traditional homeschoolers has been a little challenging for my teens in some way, because they're sheltered in a different way that the free range parenting style doesn't necessarily shelter in that way always. Not to say that that doesn't exist in the homeschool community or that all unschoolers are free range, but generally speaking, that's kind of a divide that I've seen. So anyway, that was just my 2 cents on being college adjacent.
Yeah. I guess I would say that if you are choosing not to go to college or university, but you're also not choosing to settle down into a specific career, being college adjacent is probably an easier place to find yourself for a while, because then you do at least have a lot of other people who are in that transition phase of life, right? Because if you just stay in your town or your neighborhood and all of the kids that you know have either gone off to college or they've started their career and you're not doing either one of those, you're very much alone, right? In this weird place of like, well, I'm in a transition phase and I don't have kids and I don't have a mortgage and I don't have a 9 to 5 that I have to go to and I don't have college classes that I have to go to. And like, now I feel really alone. I could see how being college adjacent and, you know, you're at least putting yourself in a position where you can find more people to hang out with,
That's
or,
a good point.
you know, more people to go get a drink with or to talk about random things or play some music or, you know, kind of whatever. So I can see that. I mean, I still have my doubts about the idea in general, but I can see how that would probably be a little bit better opportunity for making friends and connections in transitions, right? Transitions are hard at any age. Adult transitions, when you move and when you become a new parent, right? And like trying to find people who are in the same place, like transitions are just hard at any age. And so anytime you can kind of put yourself in a community where there are other people kind of going through the same transition at the same time, I think you increase your chances of finding someone you click with.
That's true. Yeah. Good point.
Okay, so let's see what else. My next comment was just on the next page. So you've got a new section starting on page 180. It's called Finding Mentorship and Guidance. And he says a lot in here. For me, the first quote that I really pulled out is on page 83 in that section. And the quote just says, "When you spend enough time asking strangers for help, you stop fearing rejection." And I don't know. I just felt like that rubbed me the wrong way a little. I don't personally worry much about rejection. That's not my style. Like, I'm real big on the fact that like the worst thing that's going to happen is you'll be in the exact same position you were before. But I know that I am unusual in that way. And I know that there are plenty of people out there who do have a fear of rejection. They have anxiety for a whole, there's just a whole host of reasons that you may fear rejection. And to say like, I'm just going to keep pushing you out of your comfort zone. And the more times you do it, like eventually you're just going to be fine with it and it's going to feel great. And I just felt like that was like just overly simplistic and idealistic, and does kind of go against what we were talking about in the last book with that idea of remembering that things we think should be easy for our teens aren't necessarily easy, and really supporting that and encouraging it and putting the supports in place to help them succeed. I don't think that's the same as saying like, well, you have to do this. And if you do it 5 times every day, by the end of 2 weeks, you're going to be like, I don't care if people look at me like I'm a moron, like so maybe not quite that simple. All right, so I have like the next string. This is kind of unusual. I'm like, what's happening here? So then the next one was my note as well. It's on page 87. And so one of the earlier 5 stories that we started out with, one of the kids in that, or teenager, she's not a kid, Tara. She talks about how she sets up accountability for herself. And in doing that, she's found someone else who is doing this ZTC, self-directed learning business as well. And they are meeting every 2 weeks, and they share their project outlines and the progress made and give feedback to each other and hold each other accountable. And I read it and I was just like, man, I don't know, like maybe when I was younger, I would have been like gung ho on all of this tracking and meeting up every 2 weeks to self critique and peer review. And like, I don't know. I read it now in my mid 40s. And again, like, I'm disabled and I have PIM and I have ME and I have, like a bunch of neurological conditions. Like, I'm just tired. Tired. Like, no. Like, and it made me think, like, the book is based on this idea that, like, you can do this and you're going to hustle hard. And I assume that at some point you get to stop hustling hard. But the book doesn't really outline that. And then I look at people, and I know some people who have had wild success with hustling hard, and they sold their business, or they, like, and they're very well off. But I know plenty of other people who have been hustling hard for decades, and they sold this business for 50,000, and but they worked on it for 3 or 4 years. Like, that's not a very good return on investment, like. And, when you're like nearing 50 and you're still hustling hard and you don't have a retirement account and you don't have this, and like, you're single because you ended up divorced because you didn't put any time and effort into your relationship. Like, at what point do you get to like stop hustling hard and make the most of your interpersonal relationships and just like clock in and clock out for work, or, like whatever that is, and like have work-life balance? I don't know. Yeah, I'm not picking up on that, especially in today's day and age with the cost of things. My next comment was on page 88, and it's just the last paragraph. Let me find it. So it says, it's wrapping up this specific section, and it says, finding support in the forms of peer community, mentorship, and systems of accountability may be the greatest challenge you face as a self-directed learner. And perhaps it's the reason that many young people see no alternative to college. But a college degree doesn't solve this challenge either. Successful adults must always seek out communities that nourish them, mentors who inspire them, and systems of structure and accountability that work for them. Choosing the ZTC path simply means developing these skills starting now rather than 4 years down the line. And I guess for me, I was like, again, like, in some ways, I agree that you need to be practicing this. But I think that practicing it on your own is really hard. Putting it in place without someone to help guide you and help you figure it out is really hard. And I also think that college does teach this skill with scaffolding, which is, generally speaking, an ideal way to teach someone a life skill, right? We homeschool. We homeschool because we want to teach our kids independence. And we don't want them to just hit the age that they're supposed to be independent and kick them out of the house and be like, good luck, ha, ha, ha. Like, we're actively spending a lot of time teaching them life skills. And I feel like college does that with scaffolding. Just because you're in college doesn't mean that stuff is handed to you. Like, I was personally thinking about it, and yes, I'm old, so my college experience was many years ago. Don't tell my kid I said that. I'm always telling him I'm not old. But, back then I had 5 advisors, right? I had my advisor for my honors program. I had my poli-sci department advisor. I had my communications advisor. I had my study abroad advisor. I had my peer ministry job, which came with like a mentor advisor. And I didn't have a lot of interaction with any of those. My poli-sci advisor, I never took a class from him, but he was my assigned advisor, right? I took one class from my communications advisor. But just this idea, like I had all of these advisors and mentors, and they weren't just like in my life, right? Like they were there, they were assigned, but I still had to make the effort, right? In this kind of scaffolded situation where it was like, well, here they are, and here's their contact information, and they have, set office hours, but you have to actually make the effort to schedule a time on a day at a time, clear your calendar, get yourself there, ask the right questions, have these conversations with them, be aware of what you need, ask them for the help. And I just feel like, it's such a valuable life skill that most parents are not great at providing their kids. And I would argue that probably a large percentage aren't capable of providing their kids, whether it's because they didn't learn it themselves at that age, or it's because they're busy working and they're not there on the day-to-day to be able to give it to their kids, like whatever that is. And I'm like, I don't necessarily think that by going to college you're preventing yourself from learning those skills for another 4 years. I think you're learning them. Maybe you're not having to do them without the training wheels, but you're learning them.
It's a built-in structure, it's a built-in system that exists, so it's there. Some advisors better than others, but yeah, they're there,
But I mean, all advisors and mentors fall into that category,
So
right?
true.
I mean, how many times have you had like a mentor that you thought was going to be amazing, and then like you're like, oh man, I gotta find a new mentor because this did not work the way I thought it was going to.
Well. That's so true, right? Yeah. And then there's another section about marketing yourself where it says to skip college successfully, you will need to create your own signal. So basically he's saying that the college degree is a signal. And so it's like, okay, if you don't have the college degree, you have to come up with some other way to signal that you have these skills. And I'm like, okay, I think that's pretty cool. And there's some examples in the book of the way to do that. But then I'm thinking of like a hiring manager who is going to get, they're getting inundated, right? With applications. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like, the way that they do the online form for their applications that has the little drop down that says bachelor's, master's, whatever, right? Some college, bachelor's, like all this kind of stuff. It's like you can scan them really, really fast because your eyes go to like certain fields and you're like, check this pile, check that pile, right? And I feel like if you get 30 resumes from 30 self-directed people who have 30 different signals and choose to communicate them with you in 30 different ways, it's like, how much time are you going to spend necessarily looking at that?
Talk about work-life balance, right? For lack of work-life balance.
Exactly.
Like I do not have time for that.
Because odds are good that person is like doing their thing, like it's not their like dream job, right? To be sitting there and like reading these things where they're like pouring over them with great enthusiasm and interest. They're just getting shit done, right? So it's like, I don't know, I did in the meantime, since our last meeting, talk to a friend of mine who works in HR. I messaged another friend of mine who also works in HR, but in Europe, and I haven't heard back from her yet, but I did ask somebody that I know, because last week we kind of talked about like, if you don't have a college degree, like is AI even like filtering those things out, and not even looking at those. And she said at the company she's working for, no, because they're taking experience into consideration, but it's happening in other places and things like that. So, and maybe it's still just an early trend where we'll see more of it as that technology pervades and all of this. People are so scared of AI right now. And I'm like, do they not realize like freaking Clip It? You remember the Clip It guy in Word, like all those years, like that was AI, right? Like this is.
Well, that's it. Back when I worked in Silicon Valley, like when I lived in San Francisco, I just talked about that, right? It was like a decade and a half ago, and they were already talking about,
Yes.
like how the computer, like software, like sorted things, like
it's just being used in new ways, So
yeah.
Anyway, all right, your next comment made me laugh. I cracked up laughing when I was typing my notes in here.
I know. So on page 91, it's called Building Your Portfolio. And I just said, like, seriously, at this point, like, I don't want to build a portfolio just because every book that we've read says that I have to. And apparently I don't take well to that level of have to anything, right? Like, I'm so tired of hearing that I have to build a portfolio that now I'm like, fuck you and your portfolio.
I don't wanna. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I did like that. All right.
For me, the kind of next runs from 96 to 102, and it's titled Getting Your Foot in the Door. And generally speaking, it seemed like this section was talking about internal referrals, pretty much the whole thing. It kind of wraps up with this quote that says, quote, doing zero tuition college doesn't reduce your hiring potential in the modern job market. It simply changes your trajectory. Why compete with droves of college grads trying to push their way through the front door when someone can wave you through the back? And I was just like, say what?
That's why I was laughing at your
like,
note.
What? Like, what is he even talking about right now? Because, like, I have helped so many people with internal referrals. And my husband is always like, he's constantly, people are reaching out. And both of us, right? We're on LinkedIn. You can find us, and people are like, oh, do you know this person? Oh, you're like 2 degrees removed from this person. Can you help with this? Can you make this introduction? Because everyone wants someone who works in the company to put their resume in, right? Because it goes in a different pile.
Mhm.
And I can guarantee you that every single person that either one of us has helped had a college degree. So I'm like, I just want to make sure you're real clear about the fact that if you think that this ZTC and an internal referral is some secret back door that you can just walk through because no one with a college degree is doing it, like, you've got a very rude awakening coming. Like, there are plenty of people with college degrees also utilizing internal referrals.
I mean, that's that saying that's gone on forever, right? It's not what you know, it's who you know. That's that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a saying for a reason. It's the way of the world.
Well, yeah. And I mean, again, for me, that also kind of takes you back to that thing of like, yes, you are supposed to be building this network of mentors and advisors and this like great network that's going to be who you know. But that takes a lot more work than just like this kind of built-in college alumni network, right? And for better or worse, a lot of times just college alumni, like, that's like a foot in the door. They don't even have to know you. They didn't even have to be a mentor. You know, like, I 100% have had interactions with people who are like, oh, you went to that college? Like, I went to that college too. Or I knew someone who went to that college. Like, let's talk about it. Like, it just like by association, you get this weird level of internal referral, and it's thousands and thousands and thousands of people more than you have to have when you're cultivating actual individual mentors and that network.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Well, that wraps up for tonight. Next week, we will finish up the book. It's a shorter read, so if you're reading along with us, the last 2 sections are quite short, and they'll be easy to catch up on if you want. And if not, again, no worries. Please join us anyway and listen to our thoughts and send us a message telling us how dumb we are. We can take it as long as, you're not super, super mean. And if you are super mean, we'll just block you. So I suppose you can send it anyway.
Go for it.
There's always that.
There you go. And next week is our final main episode, our main topic episode, and our final book club episode of season 1. So look at that. 60 episodes. Putting a bow on it.
Yep. It's awesome. All right. So once again, thank you for joining us today. And we really do hope you tune in next week for the continuation and wrap up of this discussion. And in the meantime, happy homeschooling.
Have a great day.